to our new segment on the NeuroDiverse Christian Couples podcast, NeuroDiverse Couples Coach's Corner. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Stephanie Holmes. And if you've heard other segments of the podcast, you know I'm in a neurodiverse Christian relationship. And with me is my co-host, Barbara Grant. Barbara, will you remind our listeners who you are and introduce our guest today?
Thanks, Stephanie. Happy to be here as always. Yes, I am a neurodiverse Christian couples coach, and I have been in not one but two neurodivergent marriages with a neurodiverse adult son and many other family members. So, first of all, I am a huge fan of Bob Hamp Pt1 and the work he's been doing for years now. I discovered the work when I myself was struggling to discern abuse in my marriage. And Bob has a practice where he coaches people who are dealing with different kinds of marital or independent situations where there's some trauma, where there's a lot of discernment needed. And Bob, you have amazing clarity and teaching that has provided enormous clarity for many people on what is abusive and what are the dynamics of an abusive, traumatizing relationship, and what is godly and what is not godly, especially in the context of Christian marriage. So I'm thrilled to have you on this podcast with us, and take it away, Bob. Tell us more about you and what you're doing.
And thank you both. And Barbara, thanks for your kind words. That clarity came at a bit of a price over the years, but I'm for my own sake and healing journey, that clarity was an essential part of me finding myself again after being in an abusive marriage. And in fact, had been told by 6 different counselors that I was being abused and told them that they were wrong and I was not. And when I finally realized what was happening, I asked myself the question, how on earth did I get fooled? I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm spirit-filled. People attribute this wisdom to me. And I thought, well, how did I get fooled? And so the work that you're referring to kind of grew out of my own search for clarity. I've been a licensed marriage and family therapist for more than 30 years, been in private practice as well as worked in a number of different churches, set up some large freedom type programs in a mega church here locally, and have worked with leaders, training them and teaching them both about freedom and personal healing, but also about abuse, especially in the last 6 or 8 years when I've begun that part of my work. And so, as you say, I started that work almost accidentally because it was more about searching for my clarity. And as I often do, I taught a class while I'm sorting it out. And next thing I knew, that class was viral. And I've never really had anything that I would consider viral, but the class that I taught on Facebook Live was suddenly everywhere. And I was getting emails and calls and contacts from mostly women saying, I finally get it. I'm finally safe. Thank you. And it was that clarity that you're talking about that was me getting my head above water, but then also trying to put it out there for others who might be asking that same question.
Well, so starting with that clarity and the need so many still have for that, especially within neurodiverse marriages and even Christian marriages, where everyone has the best intentions. And whether intended or not, abuse might be happening on an impact level, right?
Right.
Maybe you could walk us through the idea of abuse in a marriage, the dynamics that you see are principles underlying it. These, of course, can apply to all marriages, all relationships, human relationships, but if we'll be asking maybe some more specifics about the neurodiverse tendencies that marriages have. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful to start, I love to start big picture and move down to the specifics. I think it's helpful to start. In fact, I want to start with what's healthy before I talk about what's abuse. And I'll do it in 1 or 2 sentences so we can move quickly. But a lot of times people don't recognize that at the foundation level of mental, emotional, and relational health is this fundamental move from dependence to independence, where we start out as children completely dependent on our caregivers. And the idea is that we move increasingly over our lifespan to where not only do I manage my outside world, but I also learn to manage my inside world. And as I learn to do that, I become somebody who can function on my own in the world, not only function on my own, but develop my own a special pathway in life, develop my own life choices, develop my own branch of my family, and so on and so forth. The fundamental shift that makes us all capable of mental, emotional, and relational health is to become responsible. Again, not responsible in the sense that I pay all of my bills only, but responsible in the sense that I'm where the buck stops. In other words, I am the person who manages my life, and therefore, if something's gone wrong, I can only fix it if I can find my responsibility in it. And so the reason that matters when we talk about abuse is what I began to realize, because, listen, I've been a marriage and family therapist for 30 plus years. So not only the story I just told about myself, but story after story after story, I find people in a range of abusive situations, everything from sexual abuse as a child through emotional abuse in marriage. And as I started to get clear about the question, how did I miss it? I realized I was looking for a stereotype. The stereotype is somebody punches you and you have a bruise. The stereotype is somebody screams at you and shames you into, submission. And though those things both happen, really the bigger issue, that's our overarching issue in all abuse, is what I'm going to call the inappropriate assignment of responsibility. And so to really show, that may not sound nearly as nefarious as it turns out to be, but when you put it in the context of how crucial responsibility is for emotional and relational health, but also let me give a quick illustration to say what happens to a small child who's sexually abused by an adult. The first thing that happens is that child is made responsible for the adult's drive. Now, notice I didn't say need, because that's not what it is, but they're made responsible to respond to the adult's drive. And then they're made responsible for the adult's choice. I did this to you because you're good, you're bad, you're pretty, you're ugly, whatever it is, the adult says to them, you're the reason I did this to you. Then they become responsible for the adult's protection. If you tell somebody, I will hurt you, hurt somebody you love, something that matters to you will come to a screeching halt. And so they make, these adults who abuse children, every step of the way, what they're saying is, you'll carry the weight of responsibility. Even though I'm a grown adult, you as a tiny child are going to bear the weight of my responsibility. And so this adult, in many cases, justifies, because they're putting the responsibility elsewhere, they're justifying their behavior by blaming it on a child. The child ends up carrying the weight of that. And over the years, I've recognized there's an actual legitimate experiential component to carrying someone else's responsibility. It's weighty. You're often, the abuse victim feels guilt that should belong to the abuser. So now translate that to emotional and psychological abuse in a marriage. And what you discover is that in a marriage, it's the exact same thing, even if no one ever lifts a hand. What you see is that one party makes the other person responsible for everything that's bad, and they take responsibility for everything that's good. And over time, there's an erosion of the foundation of mental health that says, you can't be responsible for you, you're responsible for me. And I'm not responsible for me, you're responsible for me. And so what should be the foundation of the development of two healthy people developing a healthy relationship actually moves the opposite direction. And for the person who would be considered the victim in that arrangement, there's an erosion of their sense of self, an erosion of their nervous system. In fact, I'll kind of land with this statement. I've seen some research that says that psychological abuse is actually more damaging than sexual abuse and physical abuse. And my understanding of the reason for that is because in both sexual and physical abuse, there's a clear perpetrator and a clear victim. In psychological abuse, the victim begins to believe they are the problem, and in many ways becomes their own abuser with that internal voice that says, maybe I should have fixed this. If only I could have done better. What did I do wrong? What's wrong with me that this isn't getting better?
Right.
And that internal voice, you end up with the abuse of the abuser, the abuse of your own internal voice. And of course, in the dynamic of abuse, there's always the triangle of third parties, whether counselors, pastors, friends, who are also going, why can't you try harder? Because if you try harder, your poor abuser will finally be okay.
Yeah.
So they end up triple abused.
Well, this is so much of what you're describing. The book that Stephanie and Dan captained that's coming out soon, Uniquely Us, details so many heartbreaking accounts of people who have what we would call the trauma bond, the cognitive dissonance that happens in terms of identity, what is right, whose responsibility, am I guilty, the shame of wanting to leave a marriage or even think of leaving a marriage as a Christian woman, and also the dependence, of emotional, financial, physical, parental dependence that many people have on their spouse, abusive or not. So they have this sense of entrenched fear, victim mentality, where thoughts of leaving terrify them, and they feel completely disempowered in terms of that anybody would back them, that God even would favor them. Stephanie, do you want to share the account you told Bob before we went on about what one pastor told a woman would happen for her in heaven if she stayed?
Yes, and the account is actually told in the book, anonymously, of course. The woman was told by her Christian community that if she stayed, she would receive like extra reward at the Bema seat of Christ, because we are called to, suffer in marriage, or, marriages are hard. And that's kind of part of what makes them hard, is you just suffer, and you suffer for Jesus, and your, suffering will be kind of counted in your favor, in this next life. So just endure it like a good little soldier. So I'd really like to talk about, because you talked about that third piece, a pastor, clergy, community, elders, people get in and put usually the heavy down on the woman, not always, right. But talked also about the power differential. We were kind of talking about that before. There's abuse, and yes, men can abuse women and women can abuse men, but sometimes that power differential is what causes a huge issue. And now I could leave my marriage and lose my community, lose my pastor, my kids lose belonging. We're all, get the big shame badge on us because we didn't work hard enough and pray hard enough and, do enough. And the weight that gets put usually on the wives, that it's their responsibility to save the marriage at all costs. So I'd love to kind of talk about, when does something become abusive? And then also this power differential, which can contribute to the abusive cycle, when third parties do get involved in harm, honestly.
Yeah, honestly, I would say that something's defined as abuse. First and foremost, that inappropriate assignment of responsibility is the dynamic. And when that's one-sided, and it's one-sided because of the power differential, so there's a relationship between the two questions you're asking. When there's a power differential, that's actually one of the prerequisites for abuse anyway. If there is no power differential, nobody can get away with abuse. And so let me define power differential for our listeners for a second. Any way that one partner has more power than the other. Now, the obvious one we all think of immediately is physical strength, and often that's why we stereotypically think that males are the abusers and females are the victims. But there's another significant dynamic, two significant dynamics that creates a power dynamic in an intimate relationship. One of them is what we call the principle of least interest. And what that means is that the person who's the least interested in the relationship has the most power. And so if a wife is like, I could care or not care, and the husband's like, no, I really want to be married to you, then she has power in the relationship because she's willing to walk away and he's willing to do whatever it takes to stay. You can see there's even potentially a religious component to that, because if the male or female has a religious belief system that says you have to stay, ought to stay, get more favor from God if you stay. And by the way, the story you told is just horrendous. There's so many horrible things about that. I don't even know if we could take time to pick that apart, but even just the big picture that God wants us to suffer at all, much less that God wants us to suffer in marriage, much less that we get rewards for suffering in marriage. So many things wrong with the whole dynamic. But back to the idea of the principle of least interest. Any partner who's willing to say, I don't care how things go, has absolute power over a partner who says, I'm deeply invested in whatever it takes to make our marriage work. And so what happens when there's kind of that, you've got the misassignment of responsibility, you've got a power differential. And then, of course, the other place that you get a power differential from is, and this is where psychological abusers are masters of this, the sympathy of the third party. And I usually use the term onlookers. So again, onlookers can be best friends, they can be neighbors, they can be Sunday school, people that are in your class. Often there are people with some sense of authority, like a pastor, a spiritual leader, a counselor, someone who has some authority to speak into it. And if the abuser can get the empathy of those people, then they get power. Again, they strengthen their power differential by having the support of the crowd, if you will. And so what it ends up with, I mentioned this, that there's kind of layers of abuse to this, that you're abused by the partner, and then you're secondarily abused by those who side with the partner because he's just, trying to tell you he loves you. He's just wanting you to be more affectionate to him. And when they get the sympathy of the onlookers, it gives them the power, but it also gets into all the terminology in the abuse advocacy world. It creates a set of what we call flying monkeys, right? From The Wizard of Oz, where she has all the flying monkeys that do her evil bidding. In the abuse advocacy world, we see that oftentimes abusers also have a small crowd of people who will back them up, both in public and private, and speak to the abuse victim.
I was going to say this is very present in neurodiverse situations. Sure. Because neurodiverse people, as a coping skill and a survival strategy, learn what we call masking. And they are presenting to the world at large as if they're fine. They're holding it together at church. They might be elders. They might be people in high positions at work, CEOs, CFOs. And no one sees what is really the dynamic of their relational deficits until those are at home. And there's something called the Cassandra syndrome, which is about the spouse that's the maybe not neurodiverse spouse that is suffering under this dynamic of, withholding, control, abuse, and they're devastated by it. And they know the truth of what's happening, but no one believes them, just like Cassandra in the mythology was a prophetess that was doomed to not be believed by anybody. So that term has come up, and we've done a podcast about that. But what you're describing is exactly what happens, right, Stephanie, in some of these
yeah. And I want to go back to something you said, Bob, because all of a sudden I'm like, I listened to the podcast as the neurotypical spouse, and I'm listening as the neurodivergent spouse. And so I want to go back to that power differential, because sometimes I call it in my book, the tale of two marriages. Like in my situation, at one point in time, my marriage was not going well and Dan's marriage was going just fine. So he had like the least reason to like want to change at that point. Now things are in a great space now, but there was that time, it's like, it's just good. Stephanie's just not content. And so he, quote, had the power. Now, what I'm afraid some listeners are hearing, because sometimes it's been 30, 40 years till we've gotten this diagnosis, and she has been pushing this couple to pastor after clergy after whatever for 20, 30 years. And then finally, when she's about to walk out the door, now he wants to change, read more books, seek the label, get the specialist. And so I'm afraid that person might be hearing, yeah, see, I'm the one who really, really, really wants the marriage. And so she's in power, or he's in power because they want to leave. But kind of talk to that space when someone's been begging, pleading, trying to change this cycle on their own. And now they're saying, I can't do anymore. Like, it's not that I won't, it's I can't. I've got nothing else to give you. And that's not the same thing that you're talking about, the power differential. Will you tease that out a little bit more?
But the power issue plays out throughout the abuse and the leaving of abuse. And I heard recently somebody say it takes up to 7 times to leave an abusive marriage, 7 attempts. But I may have confused that stat with something else, so if that's incorrect. But what I do know from my own experience counseling people since that video went out 8 years ago is that often people are so stuck, and they'll almost leave, and then they'll leave and come back, and then they'll leave again and come back, and then they'll almost leave. And there's this, you talked about the trauma bond. I think there's also, you've got to look at the power issue that's not just the power differential, and I see this also with addicts, by the way. So in a relationship where you've got somebody who's trying hard and somebody who's got the power because they're not trying hard, When this person finally gets to the point where they're either A, set boundaries, or B, really step back and start to give up, this person knows that they're losing their power. And so what they do to regain their power in the situation with an addict, they go, oh, I'm going to go to AA. I'm going to go to counseling. I'm going to do all the things you've been begging me for years. And often why it takes so many times to get out is because this person will go, oh, finally. But when they come back and give themselves fully back to the relationship, this person got their power back, and they give up on all their power surrender that they were just doing, because now they've got the person back. And so what you see is this person goes through cycles of guilt and anger. I'm so angry at what's happening, I'm going to set a boundary. But when I set a boundary, this person does better. Now, when they do better, oh, I feel guilty. I mean, they're just a good person with a terrible past, or they're just a good person who's neurodiverse. And so I'm going to come back in and let my boundaries down. And then this person, now they've got their power back, and they go right back to abusing the power that they had. So part of the power dynamic is that the abuse victim changes the power dynamic when they either leave or set clear, consistent, firm boundaries. This person, anytime they start to lose their power, will begin to, quote unquote, perform as if they're improving.
That makes sense.
Yes.
Something I also want to make sure we clarify, and it's from my own life experience, when there isn't a clarity about what is going on, why is this relationship in constant distress? Why does no marriage counseling help? No one seems to be able to understand it. And there is not yet a clear diagnosis, all right? And even sometimes when a diagnosis is finally offered, the spouse who's been suffering in, a sense of, my spouse doesn't get me, he or she withholds affection, they are living in another planet, their executive function is low, I feel like the adult in the room all the time. All the things they're feeling can really compound into a deep resentment and bitterness. And sure. The root of bitterness that grows up and defiles many. And I have sadly seen that there are partners who are the non-neurodivergent partner who are horrendously abusive in terms of the shame and the blame and the tongue lashing and the anger and their heightened sense of desperate, anxious attachment that they've never gotten what they want, and they're just going to beat their spouse up and shame them every chance they get. And then when the diagnosis comes, that can actually escalate the abuse, because I knew it, you're just unable, you're deficient, you're deficient, you're incapable of being a spouse. And I call that out in the people I'm working with, because there is sometimes a mutually abusive dynamic where it's not one or the other. Abuse is abuse, and it is both a lack of taking responsibility, right, and blaming the other for what's wrong and not wanting to see what they can do to stop the sinful cycle or the abusive cycle and get in their own lane, as I call it. Get in your own lane, set up boundaries, take a log out of your own eye. I have this whole thing of, we're not counseling as a couple until there's a period of space and grace where everybody calms down and stops the abuse and starts to do the right, nice, godly, loving thing as much as possible, because we're following Jesus, not because I'm going to be giving you good if you give only me good. I'm going to, exchange good for whatever's coming my way, but I'm not going to be a doormat anymore.
I want to play with the language a bit, because the language is super important in this.
Yes.
The way that I would define it, Barbara, there can't be abuse if they're both doing it.
Okay.
Because part of what defines abuse is the power differential.
Okay.
If both of them have a position from which they can swing and strike the other person, whether metaphorically or literally, if both of them have that position, I would call that conflictually enmeshed.
Okay.
But part of the definition of abuse is one person has power and one person doesn't have power. And again, it can be physical power, it can be cultural power, it can be the power of least interest, whatever it might be. But if it's two-way, because often, here's what happens. I'll describe it this way. So I describe this kind of a misassignment of responsibility, and even in neurotypical couples, but I assume this happens in both situations. So would love to hear from you guys. The abuse victim, there's two phases for the abuse victim. There's a phase where they don't think they're being abused at all. I'm a special helper, and I've got the tools that this person needs, and if I can just get it right, they're going to be the amazing person I know they can be. So I'm going to serve them, I'm going to love them, I'm going to do everything that they need me to do so that they can be this amazing person. And the difficulty is, if it's truly an abuse dynamic, they're taking responsibility for the other person. Of course, that never works. It's like me doing push-ups, expecting the other person to get stronger. And you just can't give the other person what they need to be mature. They have to make choices. So that's phase one. They don't even think they're being abused. They just think it's difficult, but I'm a special person that's going to help them. I'm extra loving. I'm extra kind. I've got, people who come out of abusive dynamics in their family of origin are already kind of set up to think, well, this is what life is like. But then what happens is there's a point where the abuse becomes clear in the mind of the victim. And often from that point, they start to set a boundary, but many people aren't really great at setting boundaries. Without some training and some kind of nervous system training, most people's initial steps to set boundaries are lashing out. Most people's initial steps to set boundaries are expressions of anger and expressions of control. Don't do that. You can't do that to me. Well, a healthy boundary really is not about controlling the other person. It's about controlling me. What I'm going to say is, if that keeps happening, I am going to leave this conversation. If these things don't change, I'm going to move into another house. If these things don't change, I'm going to make some changes in our relationship. So there's no attempt to control the other person in a healthy boundary. But when someone's endured in that special helper role until they just run out of steam and they start to realize this is never going to change, in fact, it's getting worse, which is what happens when you pour gasoline on a fire or when you continue to take responsibility for somebody who is abusive in nature, right? So when you continue to take responsibility for them, you're feeding the beast that you wish would die. And so there comes a point where the abuse victim says, I've had enough. And their first initial attempts come across pretty, depending on personality, those kind of things, come across pretty biting and harsh. And if they grow out of that, that's a pretty natural thing. But if they camp there, here's what happens. I say in a couples dynamic, every dynamic is 50-50 except abuse. Abuse is 100% the responsibility of the abusive person. But if there is any responsibility that falls to the abuse victim, it's that they haven't left yet.
Or set up a boundary with a consequence that is significant in a protective way for the person who's being abused. That's what you're saying. Right. I would agree. Wow, yeah, this is very helpful.
Yeah, when I say haven't left yet, there should be a progressive, I know it's pretty radical. There should be a progressive, I'm going to set a boundary. Is it respected? I'm going to set a boundary. Is it respected? And at some point, it's like, rather than grow bitter, rather than, here's kind of the way I think about the healing journey, rather than become somebody other than myself, it's better that I break this off than to become some distorted version of me that doesn't look at all like the version that Jesus died for.